and patchy in nature. A few mist and fog patches again developing towards the end of the night, and temperatures under those clear spells perhaps dipping into single figures. So a dry start for most of us on Thursday morning, a grey start in places, but the sunshine soon reappears. There'll be plenty of dry weather to come for many, even though the sun might be a bit hazy at times. But a weak weather front will move into parts of Northern Ireland, Western Scotland, to give a few splashes of rain here. And again, temperatures high teens to low 20s. Perhaps a few more showers around Friday, but Saturday's looking dry and temperatures again high teens, low 20s.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Good evening. Well, as net migration approaches 1 million people per year, we have to ask and debate tonight, have the Tories failed on Brexit? At last, it's over. The Russia hoax on both sides of the pond is over. It was all a lie from the very start. Russia had nothing to do with Brexit or Trump becoming president. And we remember that 80 years ago this evening, 617 Squadron took off for the Dams raid. We'll go to Lincolnshire and think what it means 80 years on. But before all of that, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you. Good evening. The top story tonight on GB News. The Prime Minister's office has just said the EU and the UK have agreed to strengthen their cooperation on migration and the threat posed by Russia. Rishi Sunak and the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, have agreed to work to build an international coalition to provide Ukraine with combat air capabilities, supporting with everything from training to procuring F-16 jets. They met at the Council of Europe summit in Iceland today, where Mr Sunak has been addressing the Council and saying the world's most vulnerable people have been paying the price for unlawful migration. That's as the government tries to implement its own illegal migration bill, which is currently going through the House of Lords. The new law aims to tackle small boat crossings, sending asylum seekers back home or to a third country such as Rwanda.
UK should be at the heart of putting this agenda on the international minds of different people and institutions. That's what we'll be doing today, talking to other countries about cooperating, but also talking to the European Court. Now, part of my approach is to put new laws in place in the UK. That's our Stop the Boats bill. It's novel, it's ambitious, but I believe it is compliant with our international obligations. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the European Court is always conducting itself in a way which is fair, which is effective, which is transparent.
Well, in other news this evening, 2 poultry workers in England have tested positive for bird flu. Both cases are believed to be linked to the same farm, but there are no signs yet of human-to-human transmission. Test results show one of the workers infected is likely to have been contaminated after inhaling materials on the farm. It's unclear if the second person was contaminated after inhalation or whether or not they were just infected by touching the poultry. Both workers are now testing negative, and the UK Health Security Agency said the cases do not change the level of risk to human health, which remains very low to the general population. Now, 3 men who supplied fake passports to criminals have been jailed. Anthony Beard, Christopher Zetek and Alan Thompson helped murderers and drug dealers evade justice. Beard, who paid vulnerable people for their expired documents, was sentenced to 6 years and 8 months in prison. His accomplices will serve a combined term of 11 years. Essex Police is investigating an allegation of serious sexual assault against the Solihull MP Julian Knight. It follows a referral by Scotland Yard and comes after the Metropolitan Police dropped its investigation into a claim more than a month ago. Mr Knight, who was stripped of the Conservative Party whip, has denied what he describes as a false and malicious accusation. He doesn't plan to run at the next election. And 2 members of an organised crime group who smuggled 41 migrants into the UK have been jailed today. Mohammed Ahwed was sentenced today to over 2.5 years in prison at a Belfast court. His partner, Ahmed Omar, was jailed for 2 years back in March. An investigation by the Home Office found both men charged migrants £5,000 per journey. Both pleaded guilty to assisting unlawful immigration. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and the TuneIn app. This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, amazingly, it's almost 7 years since that referendum in which the great British public voted to leave the European Union. What was it about? What was it for? Well, of course, primarily, it was about us being back in control of our own laws and our own borders. But there were 1 or 2 expectations that I think were quite realistic. Anybody working in small business expected the rule book to get simpler. Those working in industries like fishing thought the whole thing would become less burdensome. Actually, what's happened is through British authorities, in some ways, we're now even more uncompetitive than we were as members of the European Union. Oh, and into the bargain, corporation tax has just gone up by 30%. In terms of the integrity of the United Kingdom, well, I'm afraid the Windsor Framework pretty much for the foreseeable future cuts Northern Ireland off from the rest of the United Kingdom. But the big one, and the reason we won the referendum, was that big working class vote and millions of Labour voters who felt immigration into Britain was completely out of control and running at too big a number. That is why the turnout was higher than anybody predicted. That is why Brexit won. And off the back of that, the Conservatives went to the country in 2019 promising immigration controls and an Australian-style point system. And we all thought, ha-ha, that sounds perfect. It means you're going to have genuine skills. It means you're going to have your own health insurance for at least 4 years, not be a burden on the state. But of course, the thing about a point system is it depends where you set the bar. And we now define skilled workers coming into Britain as those who earn substantially less than the average wage in this country. Reports in today's Telegraph suggesting the government is expecting in 2024 net migration could soar through 1 million people. That would be over 3 times higher than the biggest ever year of net migration whilst we were still members of the European Union and effectively had open borders with another 400 million people. So we're at this point. Have the Tories failed on Brexit? And I have to say, I think for millions of people who are not normally very political, but got engaged in that referendum, the perception is that the Tories have failed. I think it's hugely disappointing. I made this point last night. Some are upset with me, but interestingly, Sherelle Jacobs, a Conservative commentator in today's Telegraph, has gone further. She says Brexit is now effectively dead. Have the Tories failed on Brexit? Give me your thoughts. Farage at gbnews.uk. Well, joining me now is Lord Jonathan Marland, a former trade envoy to the Prime Minister. Jonathan, I know Boris Johnson once or twice said, oh, well, it's all about taking back control. It's not about numbers. But let's be honest. Brexit voters and 2019 Conservative voters expected fewer people to come into this country, didn't they?
Mm. Well, the whole thing is immensely frustrating, and, you know, no one more frustrated than you. You're the professor of Brexit. Yeah. I think that being a government minister now, trying to pull the levers of power is really tough. You're being let down by most institutions in the country who are failing to run the country properly.
Willfully failing when it comes to Brexit?
Well, you can slightly think, can you not? You could conceive that perhaps let's all get together in the Whitehall Civil Servants Club and decide it will stop the will of the people because we don't think it's right. And you slightly feel there's that going on, and there is real frustration, I suspect, as we've seen from the recent announcement by Kemi Badenoch that she can't rescind these laws that we've triumphed as being the way out of Brexit. But I think there's no point looking at the past, as you know as well as I do. We must look to the future.
Well, yes, but Jonathan, it's 7 years since that referendum. It's a fair moment to take stock.
No, Nigel, you're not wrong. I never disagree with you on anything, but, well, a few things I disagree with you on. On this particular thing, I defer to you. I mean, the fact is there have been lots of different headwinds. The main headwinds have been, I think, obduracy within the levers of government, within the blob, as it's called, and I think also COVID. But let
me accept that point. Let me accept that point. But strong government with strong leadership would overcome that.
It can to a certain extent. But if the forces are all aligned against you, and I've been in government, and I remember when we came in the coalition, I was Minister for Energy and Climate Change, we decided we were going to get rid of 30% of all the rules. The first 10%'s a doddle. Most of them are redundant, they're defunct, useless. You then have to push water uphill, and more water uphill to persuade not only the civil service that these are the wrong rules that have been in place, but also you've got to persuade Parliament. So it is a tough act. But that's one side. Let's look to the future. I think for Brexit to work, Sunak has got a real opportunity. He's got to get to grips with this immigration issue, which has been bubbling for a long time and succeeding.
And which the civil service are not obstructing. This is purely where they set the levels for skilled migrants to come to Britain from all around the world is purely a government, not a blob decision.
It's a bit of both, but let's not argue about that. He's got to do something about that. He's got to really get rid of a lot of this red tape and regulation, which is killing us. It's meaning the city's losing jobs, as you've enunciated, with the fishermen, with people across the country. They're fed up with this regulation that's suffocating the country. We've got to be 10% more competitive than our competitors in regulation and in tax, and at the moment, it's completely the reverse. So this country is in a very bad place. It's got The lever of government, very difficult to pull. You've got an uncompetitive tax regime, you've got an uncompetitive regulation regime, and you've therefore got the situation that you and I both remember, because we're a similar age for viewers who didn't know that, even though he looked so much younger. We're back in the situation of the 70s, where we have a government that's obsessed with process, or the levers of government obsessed with process, and now we need delivery. And until that is changed, the country's in a very...
If I'm a red wall voter, I come from a Labour voting family traditionally, but I did vote UKIP, I did vote Leave, I did vote for Boris in 2019, and I really thought that pressures on housing, pressures on the health service, pressures on the roads and transport and travel, that much of this country was at breaking point because of a population explosion. It is now much worse than it was before 2019. What's going to make me vote Tory next year? Is there anything?
Well, I think those fundamental... I think Rishi's 5 pledges are going to... And if he delivers on them, then I think the country as a whole will say, look, I'm up against Starmer, who's a social democrat, I'm up against Davey, who's a social democrat, and I've got a current Conservative Party, which is social democrat.
Yes.
I've got to... But at least I will vote for that one because he has delivered on those promises.
If he does.
If he does. If he doesn't, then obviously he will have the wrath of the voters, and deservedly so. So I think that's what will happen. But this country is not going to change until the focus is on delivery rather than this endless process that we have become obsessed with.
A somewhat pessimistic Lord Jonathan Marland there, but honest. Peter Edwards joins me, former editor of Labour List. Well, of course, this must sound like manna from heaven for anybody supporting the Labour side of the argument. But what would Labour do about migration?
Well, first of all, it's not manna from heaven. I mean, I think Labour wants the country to succeed, even though it was obviously campaigning for Remain, just like the Tories were, and that does get forgotten.
That's true.
In terms of Brexit, I want to pick up on one thing before we get kind of mired in the detail, which is part of peddling ideological fantasies is that they come crushing into reality, and then it's necessary to find a blame figure. So I accept the result, but in 2016, Nigel, you said Turkey was on the brink of joining the EU.
Yes.
And that wasn't true.
Hang on, they've been receiving pre-accession aid for 2 decades. They received billions of euros from the EU as pre-accession aid. But that's an old argument. Let's not spend too much time on it.
20 years and they hadn't got in. But now there's another ideological fantasy, which was everything was going to be fine after Brexit, and there's now a wicked blob, unspecified and vague, that are stymieing government ministers. And one thing that we might agree on, Nigel, is that if the levers of government are not working, that is down to government ministers, not this nebulous enemy.
Peter, I just said to Lord Marland, you know, there may be an obstructive blob, but strong ministers, I think, could deal with it.
Of course.
But let me get back to the question. Do Labour... I mean, net migration until Tony Blair came to power had run at 30,000 a year net for 50 years. From Windrush to the end of the century, on average, it was up some years and down the next. Blair comes in, increases the numbers significantly. The Tories come in, the numbers explode. I mean, is it viable for us to go on with net migration rising by up to 1 million a year?
1 million a year, I don't think it is. But to me, it's not a numbers game. It's about infrastructure, as you both alluded to be fair, earlier on. Because
But it is a numbers game, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've had the privilege of living in places like Cumbria and Yorkshire. Pressure on public services there is different to when you're in the South East and in London. So I think you've got to think about population density. But let's go to a broader point. There isn't public appetite for net migration of 1 million a year.
No.
It's just not there.
Or even 500,000 a year.
Yeah, and the fact that...
Or 250,000 a year.
Well, we can debate numbers, but in a sense, it won't take us anywhere. David Cameron said tens of thousands.
Yes.
We are nowhere near that.
No, absolutely. And you know, the last 4 or 5 manifestos have made similar promises. But my question is, does Keir Starmer have a plan for this?
I think so, and I think it's maybe a backhanded compliment. The government has started to borrow elements of that. So I remember as far back as in the Ed Miliband era, 2013, 2014, Yvette Cooper, first time around in the shadow cabinet, said an Australian-style point system. That's now the message that the government are preaching. Keir Starmer said if he wins the election, they won't go back to freedom of movement and they won't seek to rejoin the single market.
So basically, it'd be exactly the same.
I don't think it'll be exactly the same, because the other point I'd make, and by the way, Labour does have a long list that I could read out, but it would take a long time, around mutual recognition of qualifications, getting goods from Britain into Northern Ireland with less paperwork, a security pact. But that's a lot more of the technical detail. I think the other thing that a Labour government after Brexit would do differently is it wouldn't overpromise. Lord Marland alluded to the reneging on the promise of the number of EU regulations that was going to be burnt.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch now says she can't do that. But it also wouldn't get bogged down in this internal ideological warfare over Brexit. And I think that's the remarkable thing about the Conservative Party when I'm outside it. See a Brexiteer Prime Minister still being crippled at times by fighting in his own party.
Well, I mean, you know, this broad church idea is what we get from the first past the post electoral system. And Labour's got its challenges on the left too. But a quick thought, if I can, Peter. You know, this, and it was floated over the weekend, that maybe, 6.5 million people, 16 and 17-year-olds and EU nationals living in the country should all get the vote. Now, they wouldn't get the vote anywhere else in Europe. And, of course, unsurprisingly, the Mail and the Sun say this is a deliberate attempt to gerrymander to get us back into the European Union. So is Starmer being honest with us?
I think he's being honest because it's good politics from a domestic point of view, and we've got to be frank that younger voters are more likely to vote for a left-of-centre party, so it could help Labour in the long term. But the other thing as someone inside the Labour Party is you've got to accept Keir Starmer isn't going to take Britain back into the EU. It's not going to happen, and it would be political suicide for him to do so. But what I'd say to the Conservative Party is it's in the narrow self-interest of the Conservative Party to, again, whip up an ideological fantasy that has no bearing on reality, that we're going to rejoin the EU under Labour. It's not going to happen, and it's exactly the same scare story tactics as a coalition of the SNP. It's not going to happen. But it's in the partisan self-interest of the Conservative Party to spread this myth.
Well,
Starmer, whatever you think, is not a dummy. We're not going back.
Peter, let's be honest, scare stories about the other side winning have been going on for longer than you and I have been around. There's nothing very new there.
We're not going back in, though.
No, we're not going to go back into the European Union. I get that. However, I can see a Starmer government taking us much closer to single market
But how?
rules.
Let me challenge you on that. How? Because he said no more single markets, so how?
Oh, because we can align with all new EU law. It's quite simple to do that. And had the Conservatives done their job, Jonathan Marland, and taken us away from EU law, not personally, but it would have been a damn sight more difficult for Labour to take us back in that direction. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. All I can say is I'm enormously disappointed, and I just don't think there's a cat's chance in hell of the Conservatives getting back those red wall voters next year, or keeping those red wall voters, unless something very, very radical happens. In a moment, after the break, it's over. The Russia hoax on both sides of the pond is over. I'm delighted, and yet I don't see a single newspaper inch, whereas before the headlines were Farage under investigation by the FBI for links with Russia. No one's apologising, but it's over. All of that in just a moment.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
So have the Tories failed on Brexit? Some of your reactions coming in. Ian says via email, the Tories haven't failed on Brexit, they've sabotaged Brexit and defied the referendum will of the British voters. For this, they must be punished at the ballot box. Ian, I suspect they're going to be. Mark says, now that you've recently admitted on camera that Brexit is a failure, will you soon be moving abroad like you said you would? Before the Brexit vote, if Brexit was to fail. That comes from Mark. It's probably James O'Brien or someone like that in reality. The Tories have failed us on Brexit. They've proved to be as useless as leaders as the ones we had from the European Commission. It isn't Brexit that's a failure, it's the Tories' handling of it. And there's a reason for that. And Alan picks this up via email very effectively when he says, it's time we got real. Parliament of all parties failed by not being 100% behind the instruction the country gave them. And here's the truth of it. And Peter Edwards alluded to this. We've all forgotten that the Conservative Party was a Remain party. Yes, there were Brexiteers, but they were out on the edges. It was a Remain party. And ultimately, we've asked, under our system, a Remain party to do Brexit. And they never actually believed in it. In fact, to be honest with you, I'm not even sure Boris Johnson ever really actually believed in it. Now, it's over. The Russia hoax is finally over. On this side of the pond, thank God, because I really got pretty tired of Guardian headlines such as Farage is a person of interest as FBI examines Russian link to Republicans. The Mail, FBI includes Farage in Russia probe. And it went on, and I mean, New Zealand, newspapers in Borneo, all over the world. Aaron Banks being probed over links to Russia. Trump-Russia inquiry looks into Farage links. I mean, it was endless, and it went on for years. I was even told, verbatim on Radio 4's Today programme that I was under investigation by the FBI as a matter of fact. Poor old Aaron Banks, well, they gave him one hell of a time. Do you know, in the end, when the Electoral Commission couldn't find any Russian financial links to Banks's campaign, a parliamentary committee headed up by a Conservative Member of Parliament, Damian Collins, vindictively referred him to the National Crime Agency. Much of this came as a result of what was written in The Guardian by a journalist called Carol Cadwalla. I am delighted and thrilled that last week Aaron Banks received financial compensation from that journalist for making defamatory comments in print. And at some point in the next couple of weeks, costs will be awarded in Mr. Banks's favour as well. And yet, I bet you haven't read a single line in a British newspaper about it. Well, much the same is happening on the other side of the pond, where Special Counsel John Durham has concluded a 4-year probe. And his conclusions about the way the FBI and other agencies in America have operated is far from pretty. But don't take it from me. Let's go to David Chern, former attorney specialising in federal criminal defence and a former Donald Trump impeachment lawyer. David, welcome to the programme. 4 years of John Durham. What are his conclusions?
Well, his conclusions are relatively strong. Unfortunately, the consequences are not. He concluded, most importantly, I think, that there was no basis for the so-called special counsel Mueller Commission investigation in the first place. Secondly, perhaps, and maybe more importantly, it was driven by political partisan agendas, including collusion, for lack of a better term, with the Hillary Clinton campaign. Unprecedented to have a political partisan in a race driving an criminal investigation by the Department of Justice. And then I think we saw, it's important to me as a lawyer, we saw conclusions that clearly Justice Department officials lied in applications for surveillance techniques that are the most intrusive that we allow in our system, to the so-called FISA court, F-I-S-A, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Extraordinary. And that court itself provides strict rules on correcting any mistake. But of course, these don't appear to have been mistakes. This was driven by people like Andrew Weissman, who's the single most ethically bankrupt prosecutor I've ever dealt with. But there are no real consequences to this.
No, and that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, Trump from the start said, Russia, 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 it's all a giant hoax. Durham absolutely concludes that there was insufficient evidence, as you say, for any of this to go ahead. But, I mean, is it the same as this side of the pond? I don't see Aaron Banks or myself getting a word of apology out of any of the press that sensationalised these ridiculous claims that were made at the time. Is it similar in the USA? Is anybody saying poor old Donald Trump was put through years of this for nothing?
Absolutely. You know, you make a very important point here. You know, you're well known around the world as a respected journalist, but I would tell you that anyone over here who comes up with your name not only associates you as being a tremendously well-respected journalist, but also associates you with this so-called Russia probe. Listen, many people from the start, Alan Dershowitz and others, I wrote an op-ed piece on it at the time, said that there was no basis even for the appointment of the special counsel. It simply wasn't authorized under the statute. But they went forward with it, and they knew what they were doing when they went forward with it, and it tied up the administration for years. I'll tell you, I did serve as lead counsel for Donald Trump's impeachment trial, the second trial, but I've been a civil rights lawyer for 38 years and a criminal defense lawyer for 38 years. This is not a political issue for me. It's an issue of basic civil rights, quite frankly, and it's a reputational issue. People's lives have been ruined over this hoax.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And presumably, though, the one person that will talk about this now endlessly is Donald Trump himself.
Yeah, you can be sure he'll get as much mileage as possible out of it, but again, without the consequences. But it turns out that a lot of what he said that they dismissed was right. He knew it was ill-founded from the start. But again, you know, we knew this from the appointment of the Mueller Commission. If you have a commission that the public is supposed to believe in, then you don't put people on it who only have one political agenda. And it's headed up again by a guy like this Andrew Weissman and other contributors to one political party. I represented the Democratic Party last year in litigation. I've represented libertarian parties. Again, that's not a political statement. It's simply a matter of fact. In order to garner public support, you have to have a bipartisan approach.
No, absolutely. David Chern, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening on GB News.
Thank you very much. Pleasure. Pleasure.
So vindication on both sides of the pond, but, as David Chern said, very few consequences. In a moment, 80 years ago, this very evening, out of RAF Scampton, the Dams raid was launched. We will commemorate that in just a moment and think about the inspiration it's been to the Royal Air Force ever since.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing with the audience very much at the heart of it. Like like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel. 7 p.m.
On this night, 80 years ago, Guy Gibson, who was subsequently to get the Victoria Cross for the action, led 19 Lancasters that took off from RAF Scampton. They were flying with a bomb that was the heaviest payload the RAF had carried at that point of the war. They were flying with a bomb that had never been used operationally. They normally flew at 20 to 30,000 feet. But for this operation, they had to fly at 60 feet, which was lower than the actual wingspan of the aircraft. 8 of those Lancasters did not return, so it was a very, very heavy human price that was paid by the crews. But they did breach the Mona and Ida dams and hit and damage the Sorpe Dam, and it was considered to be a huge, upbeat, moral uplift for the country. A success at a time when, frankly, we weren't having very many of them. Well, of course, there's been huge controversy recently over RAF Scampton as it is emptied of its historic artefacts, and we're even told that Guy Gibson's dog that was killed in a car accident the day of the raid, even that's been dug up and sent somewhere else. Desecration, I believe, at Scampton in turning it into a migrant centre, but today we remember those men and what they achieved 80 years ago. And we're heading now to Will Hollis, who is at the Dam Busters Memorial in Woodhall Spa. And Will, I have to ask you, 80 years on, how is this extraordinary event being remembered?
Yes, good evening, Nigel. Well, if you could see this memorial here in Woodhall Spa, which became the home of 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, in the months after the raid, if you could see the edges, you'd see lots of people who are sat waiting with cameras because in just about half an hour, the Battle for Britain memorial flight is going to fly over with the UK's only flying Lancaster. There are only 2 Lancasters that are still flying right now in the world. One of them is in Canada, one of them is right here in Lincolnshire, and while it's not uncommon to hear the Lancaster flying over, it is uncommon, incredibly rare, to hear it flying over so many places at once. And today, all throughout Lincolnshire, the Lancaster, has been flying across old air bases, former RAF bases, because this was Bomber Command, it was Bomber County, and it's the place that flew all of those missions, as well as, of course, RAF Scampton, where the Dam Busters mission flew from. So people are waiting for that to fly over shortly. But we've been talking about why this matters. Why are we remembering the Dam Busters and the men who gave their lives, the 53 men who fought and died in that particular raid during the Second World War? And Chris Williams, who's a part of the 617 Squadron Association, whose dad was a part of 617, a squadron in the months after the Dams raid, who flew raids on Normandy as well as Fortress Europe. He's probably the best person to say why we're still remembering this 80 years on.
Ingenuity of the science and technology and the significance of what they did to change the war in a small way at a very important time, because British morale had taken a beating earlier on, and it was very good to take the war to the enemy, and that's what they did. And we shouldn't forget that, and in modern times there are similar episodes, of course, which are equally significant, and we should not forget.
It's a story that we never seem to tire of telling, taking the war to Germany, attacking the industrial heartland, something that had never really been done until that point in the war. But it is ultimately about remembering the people that gave their lives. It's important to remember that it wasn't just men from Britain, it was men from across the Commonwealth, from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. You'll see their names alongside the names of the men from Britain who flew and died in the missions for 617 Squadron, because it's important to remember that while the Dam Busters, which we're acknowledging today for the 80th anniversary, was the start of 617 Squadron, it was not the end of 617 Squadron, and they still fly today in the Royal Air Force.
Thank you very much indeed, Will Hollis. And absolutely, of course, Leonard Cheshire went on to lead 617 Squadron for much of the rest of the war after Guy Gibson subsequently VC went missing. Well, joining me down the line is Sir Michael Graydon, Chief of the Air Staff for the Royal Air Force 1992 to 97, and he's at the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln as I speak to him. Sir Michael, operationally, with very little notice and not much training, what Gibson's men achieved on that night was pretty remarkable stuff, wasn't it?
Exceptional, without doubt. You're quite right. They didn't get a great deal of time. They were selected pilots, and obviously they were very well led by Guy Gibson. The training that they carried out was incredible. But yes, a very short time to prepare for something that they carried out superbly.
How much? I mean, you know, I know with British Army regiments and the Navy, and I'm sure with the Air Force, there becomes a sort of a tradition, a kind of a sort of the men that come, women that come afterwards want to uphold the standards of those that have gone before. I mean, 80 years on, do Guy Gibson's men have any relevance to today's Royal Air Force, or are they still looked up to as being an important example?
I think we cherish, in the Royal Air Force, we cherish all great men like Guy Gibson, great leaders. We learn from them, and we admire them hugely. I mean, I'm standing, as you said, at the Bomber Centre here, and 617 Squadron, of course, is very special. But you know, nearly 58,000 young men died, young men, women, because we remember the ground crew as well, who were attacked on the ground here, and the air crew, and every one of their names is on the stands around this memorial. It's a very special place, and we will continue to cherish the memory of 617 Squadron and all those who took part in Bomber Command in World War II.
Well, Sir Michael Graydon, I have visited that Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln myself, and I'm going to pick up on your words and say to anybody, if you're looking for a trip to Lincoln, which itself is an amazing, beautiful city to visit anyway, go to the Bomber Command Museum. It is quite awe-inspiring, just the level of sacrifice those people gave. Sir Michael, thank you for joining us on GB News on this anniversary. Thank you. Now, the What the Farage moment. Mark White, GB News' Home and Security Editor, has put together this package, and it's on UK criminals providing false British passports for dangerous criminals. Watch it.
Come back in 20 minutes.
About that, yeah.
I've got an angel.
Covertly filmed by undercover officers, this is organised crime boss Anthony Beard handing over passport photographs for processing. Part of a high-level conspiracy to provide fraudulent passports to the criminal underworld, helping murderers, kidnappers and many other serious criminals to operate under different identities and evade capture. In a cafe in southeast London, Anthony Beard was secretly filmed meeting with an identity donor, often vulnerable individuals with drink and drug addictions who were paid to hand over their old passports and allow the criminals to effectively assume their identity. Beard would then apply for a passport renewal online, sending in a photograph of the criminal instead of the original passport holder. Any delay in processing would often see Anthony Beard himself posing as the applicant, calling the passport office to chase them up.
I haven't received the text, right, and it's been just over 2 weeks, so I want to see if you've received it. That's all I'm phoning for.
Subject detained, premises clear.
Okay. Brilliant. After one of the biggest national crime agency investigations of recent years, officers arrested Anthony Beard and co-conspirator Christopher Zetek. He acted as a broker between Beard and the crime groups. Jamie Acorn, an original suspect in the murder of Stephen Lawrence, was brought to justice as a direct result of the passport investigation. Acorn, who's always denied involvement in the UK's most notorious racist murder and who's never been convicted of that crime, was extradited back to the UK from Spain and jailed for his part in a major drugs conspiracy. More than 50 other fugitives were also arrested as a direct result of the passport scam investigation.
These are very high-end organised crime networks, could obviously have the means to pay for a full passport that went anything from up to £15,000, which obviously allowed them to travel internationally. I'd turn around and say that this was the golden ticket for the organised crime networks in order that they could evade arrest, evade identity by local law enforcement, either internationally or at home in the UK.
Anthony Beard was secretly filmed as he met some of those high-ranking criminals hoping to receive a passport from him. In another covert audio recording, Christopher Zetek could be heard telling Beard what one passport recipient is wanted for.
He's wanted for voluntary murder, kidnapping, hostage taking, theft use of arms, drug trafficking, arms and ammunition trafficking, cybercrime, money laundering and serious injury.
This investigation exposed a worrying weakness in the UK's passport application system, which allowed criminals to exploit the document renewal process. The Home Office says those processes have since been tightened. With Anthony Beard and Christopher Zetek now behind bars, the National Crime Agency says it believes Beard obtained hundreds of fraudulent passports for criminals over the more than 2 decades he operated. Mark White.
Well, it's a very shocking report there from Mark White. But what annoys me is that man, Anthony Beard, who for 2 decades has done all he can, at great financial advantage to himself, to help serious criminals get passports and come and live and operate in this country. The prison sentence for that is 6 years. He'll serve 3 and be out. And who knows, maybe do it all again, and that drives me mad. In a moment, Michael Gove's Renters Reform Bill is due before Parliament tomorrow. I have had so much feedback from viewers and listeners as to what a disaster it is. We're going to delve deeper in just a moment.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, Michael Gove's Renters Reform Bill was supposed to come before the House of Commons last week. We're now told it'll happen tomorrow. But since I've touched on this subject and the changes to tax laws, to regulations, the number of people getting in touch to say, look, you know, we're involved in the rental market, but we're thinking of getting out of it, all of which means it's harder and harder for people to find places to rent and that the costs are going up way above inflation. I think this is a very real issue. A couple of examples here. Mario from Northampton says, I'm a landlord and the main issues are mortgage costs, only that businesses now can't write those costs off against their income, not being able to reclaim your property after a contract is up. And Bob says, we are the landlords of 3 flats. We are now renting at a loss. Our good tenants are at risk if we have to sell to avoid losing money. And he makes a point here, EPC cannot be achieved on a grade 2 building. Now, this means government environmental standards as we head towards net zero are pretty meaningless on a grade 2 listed building. Well, joining me is Ben Beadle, landlord and chief executive of the National Residential Landlords Association. Ben, welcome to the programme. Are we hoping, with this delay of a week, that Michael Gove might have seen the light?
Nigel, I think we're optimists, but I wouldn't say we're that optimistic. Look, we have to see the detail of the bill tomorrow afternoon. Our stance on this will reiterate what a lot of people have been in touch with you about. Whether you like them or loathe them, landlords must have confidence in the changes that are coming. If they don't, well, they can invest elsewhere, and that will be bad news for everybody.
Yeah. Do we have any idea, up until now, within the last year or so, how many properties have been taken off the letting market?
Well, it's a curious situation. Before Christmas, the private rented sector had shrunk by about 250,000 homes. It's actually gone up since then. What we know is we are forecasting the biggest level of disinvestment for a decade. And that is for a multitude of reasons, not just because of rental reform, although rental reform needs to command the confidence of landlords. It's because of all of the things that you've set out: taxation, energy, mortgage costs. The average landlord will be looking at what they can get with their bank and thinking, well, maybe it's less hassle that I sell and put my money there. And I have some sympathy for that argument, which is why we do need to get these reforms right.
Why? Oh, why, Ben? Why is Michael Gove doing all of this?
Well, it's a very good question. We're not building social homes. The build-to-rent sector, much championed by the Conservative government, equates to about 2% of the private rented sector. The PRS is roughly 20%. It's a big beast. I think we'd be first to accept, Nigel, that there are some issues around the edges, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater on this. We have high levels of satisfaction in the sector, higher than what we've seen in the social sector. And we haven't seen some of the awful stories, frankly, that we have seen in the social sector in the past few months. So what we want to see is good landlords championed and bad landlords rooted out. That can't be a lot to ask, surely.
Ben, I'm absolutely on your side on this, because I know, actually, those in the end that will really lose out are people on low incomes, students away at university, and it's going to be a disaster if we carry on down this route. Ben Beadle, thank you for joining me this evening on GB News. Now we've got a couple of Barrage the Farages to more or less end the programme. One is Scott, who was with us apparently in Bournemouth last week.
I wonder what your thoughts were about Ben Bradley leading a rebel of MPs from the Red Wall, and do you think Rishi's over?
Well, look, I think the Red Wall MPs are pretty angry. Many of them were very, very surprised to be elected in the first place. And I honestly think, they can have their conferences in Bournemouth or this week in London or whatever it is. I would have thought Rishi Sunak's position as leader is pretty safe and secure. They would look absolutely ridiculous, I guess, to get rid of yet another leader. So I think you're going to see Red Wall MPs floundering around, and many of them looking for other jobs, being fairly certain they'll lose their seats next year. That's my view. Let's go to Kathy in High Wycombe.
Hi Nigel, I'm Kathy Bryant from High Wycombe Beekeeping Association. We've lost a lot of bees in this last winter. Why are farmers being allowed to use banned insecticides which are killing our bees?
Oh, Kathy, I can't give you an answer to that. I thought it was the Asian hornets that were posing a threat to the bees. Look, I do know bees are a very important, very vital part of our ecosystem. I can't specifically answer on any pesticides. I don't know. These rows are endless. All I will say is we must be getting something right, because I'm seeing more birds of prey in my home area than I've ever seen in my life. I lived there all my life, than I've ever seen in my life. So we must be, in terms of what we're putting on the land, we must be doing things a little bit better than we used to before. Now, that is pretty much all you've got from me this evening, but I'll be handing over in a moment to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, I'm so disappointed. I mean, net migration heading towards 1 million. Brexit's a failure under the Tories, isn't it?
I don't think Brexit's a failure. I don't think this is a failure of
Tory
Brexit.
management.
The key to Brexit, as you and I both know, is democratic control. Whether with democratic control you do good things or bad things is up to you.
All I'm saying is, with so many of those Red Wall voters, immigration was the issue.
Well, we're at the point now where we were meant to come down from the hundreds of thousands to the tens of thousands, and we're now hoping we might come down from the millions to the hundreds of thousands. And the Home Secretary is on the right side of this, so I think we need to be backing her.
Well, after all the 13 years, I can't back anybody, really.
Oh, come on, we need you.
No, I've pretty much given up
home
on
to the Tories.
I've given up on you lot, I have to say. Jacob's going to be with you in a moment for the next hour. That's it from me. Back with you tomorrow at 7 o'clock. But first, the all-important weather.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather forecast. I'm Greg Dewhurst. Well, sunny spells over the next few days. There is the risk of some rain in the forecast, largely affecting the north and northwest of the UK at times. Looking at the bigger picture, high pressure holds on, keeping most weather systems at bay, but just notice they will scoot across the far north at times. This weather front perhaps sinking a little further south by Friday. Tuesday ends on a quiet note, plenty of clear spells to end the day, perhaps just a few lingering showers initially, but overnight it should be largely dry. And with that high pressure around and light winds, we could just see a few mist and fog patches. And under the clear skies, turning quite chilly, temperatures mid-single figures, perhaps an isolated touch of grass frost to start Wednesday morning, but that means sunny spells, though it is cloudier across eastern areas first thing, but the cloud tends to lift and break a little, perhaps just enough for a few light showers across central southern England for the afternoon, and then just one of those weather fronts skirting the far north of Scotland. In between, where we get the sunny spells, temperatures lifting, largely the mid to high teens, perhaps 19 or 20 across southern parts of England and Wales. Into the evening time on Wednesday, the cloud starts to melt away again. We see largely dry nights, still some rain and drizzle affecting central and northern parts of Scotland, but generally light and patchy in nature. A few mists and fog patches again developing towards the end of the night, and temperatures under those clear spells perhaps dipping into single figures. So a dry start for most of us on Thursday morning, a grey start in places, but the sunshine soon reappears. There'll be plenty of dry weather to come for many, even though the sun might be a bit hazy at times. But a weak weather front will move into parts of Northern Ireland, Western Scotland to give a few splashes of rain here. And again, temperatures high teens to low 20s. Perhaps a few more showers around Friday, but Saturday's looking dry and temperatures again high teens, low 20s.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "No, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
Is the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.